Lowood dates from the 1750s and is the perfect setting for the museum's impressive collection. Discover the fascinating story of the local area through displays of geology, social history and photographs of town life in the 19th century. The thriving temporary exhibitions gallery is also not to be missed. Most of the objects in the museum were donated by members of the local community. If you have an item that has historical links to the borough of Broxbourne, please contact the museum curator before you dispose of it.
Beautiful, aren't they? And they're only a few of the thousands that reach our homes every week from the Lea Valley, a sea of glass 10 miles long and 8 miles wide, which provides a livelihood for over 500 growers and 6,000 regular workers, plus part-time labourers during the summer months. 1,000 acres of shining rooftops, a third of all England's glass houses, are here.
Well, that was the picture in the Lea Valley in the 1950s. But of course it all started very much longer ago than that. Here in Whithurn Park at Churchgate was established the first commercial nursery in Cheshunt that we know of. In 1806 Adam Paul came here and began to grow plants in the open air. His two sons, George and William, later in the 19th century also went into the nursery business and became very well known as growers and breeders of roses. Paul Scarlet in particular became a very popular garden climbing rose. It wasn't until later in the 19th century that the commercial greenhouse as we know it was developed. This was aided by the removal of a tax on sheet glass in 1845, which made them more economical to build. Many of the families who later became household names in the nursery industry began their careers as gentlemen's gardeners. Michael Rochford came over from Ireland in 1840 and worked in several large houses where he learned to grow melons and grapes. By 1860 he had set up his own nursery in Tottenham, and his sons Thomas, Edmund and Joseph followed in his footsteps, at first also in Tottenham, but by the 1880s had moved to Turnford. This was part of a general trend for nurseries to move northwards up the Lea Valley to escape the fog and pollution, especially in the days when coal was the universal fuel. Their continued growth during the 19th century owed much to a plentiful supply of water and access by rail for the delivery of the coal used to heat the greenhouses. Being close to the railway, however, did have its disadvantages. My grandfather, George Rooke, with his brother-in-law, took over a small nursery in 1884 near Northumberland Park Station in Tottenham, right beside the railway line. Things were fine for a few years, and then the railway company decided to build sidings right alongside the nursery. And this resulted in a great deal of pollution, with smut and soot falling on the glass and retarding the growth of the plants. On the advice of Thomas Rochford, grandfather and his brother-in-law sued the Great Eastern Railway. There was a High Court case in 1900 where they claimed damages of about £400 for the loss of profits. To everyone's surprise, they won their case, which was a nice instance of the small man being successful against a big company. But despite this, they also moved northwards, grandfather coming to Longfield Lane in Cheshunt in 1902, and Uncle Harry going to Palmer's Green. Thomas Rochford at Turnford were probably the biggest nursery ever in the district. Rochford himself had a social conscience and did a great deal to keep his employees happy. Mind you, he expected long hours from them and hard work. But he treated his employees so well that many of their sons were only too happy to go and work for the same firm when they left school. And there are several instances of generation after generation of the same family working for Rochfords. He built terraces of houses for his workers to live in. In the middle of one of the rows of cottages there was a large institute, which was a sort of social club for his employees. Incorporated within this social club there was sleeping accommodation for bachelor workers, particularly the young Scandinavian chaps who came over to learn the trade. There would be evening entertainments, musical evenings and sports days, and you could virtually live your social life on the facilities provided by the firm. The nursery became famous for its black grapes, each of the large greenhouses producing 8 tons a year. Another activity was potted palms, which were exported worldwide. This particular shipment went down with the Titanic in 1912. Carriage was more and more being taken over by motor transport. Thomas Rochford took delivery of his first van in 1915, and in the same year his first motor car. By the 1930s, the Lea Valley contained the largest concentration of greenhouses in the world. The Stevens family, in their many nurseries, grew roses and achieved international fame for them. Pollards also grew roses and carnations.
But the principal crop, occupying 2/3 of the whole area, is the tomato, the love apple of bygone days when it was grown as an ornamental plant. Tomatoes were introduced by the Spaniards from Peru in the 16th century, and now more than 150 varieties are in cultivation. Picking begins in early May and goes on throughout the season up to October or November. Cucumbers also have a long history, 3,000 years or more in India, where a possible ancestral species grows wild in the Himalayas. A hot, steamy atmosphere suits them well, and their cultivation accounts for 1/5 of all the glass.
Many other trades grew up in association with the nursery industry. Probably one of the most important was the manufacture of clay flower pots.
In the little village of Upshire, on the edge of Epping Forest, flower pots are made from fine Essex clay. In former days, it was dug by hand, but now machines can provide in a week enough to last the pottery for 2 years. The giant machine scrapes up the clay, and load after load is dumped at the top of the pit. A bulldozer pushes it into a heap, where it will be left exposed to the weather. After many weeks of weathering, and with water added, the soft clay is taken by truck to the pottery. Before it can be used, it must pass through the grinding machine. The clay is shoveled into a hopper at the top. It passes between 2 sets of rollers to a mixer. As the clay comes from the grinding machine, it is cut into pieces and stacked, ready for the potters. At this pottery, some flower pots are molded on a machine. The ball of clay is dipped in oil so that the pot will not stick to the mold. The handmade pots are shaped on a potter's wheel. As the wheel turns, the clay is skillfully molded by the potter. The speed of the wheel is controlled by this round pad. Making large pots calls for special skill, which is only obtained by long experience. The lump of clay is cut into pieces with a thin wire. Each piece is then rolled into a convenient shape, ready for throwing onto the wheel. The drainage hole in the bottom of the pot is made by the potter while his hand is molding the inside. On this wheel, a foot pedal works two cones, which control the speed at which the pot turns. This hand wheel marks the firm's name and address. And with a thin wire, the completed pot is cut from the wheel. The pots are left to dry for several days. They harden enough to be handled, but remain the yellow color of clay. They must be baked in a kiln before they can be used. Let us look inside. The kiln is stacked with the dried pots. When it is full, the doorway will be sealed up and the fires lit. After 5.5 days of heating, the fires are allowed to go out and the kiln cools down. When the kiln is cool enough, the doorway seal is broken down. The fired pots, which have changed from yellow to red in the firing, are now unloaded. And so, from Essex clay, through the skillful hands of the potter, come the flower pots which will be used by nurserymen and gardeners throughout the countryside.
It was very much a father-to-son operation. The sons of potters were employed as wedgers. They were the youngsters that formed the clay into balls. The wedgers were also trained as pot makers, and they were in their young teens, perhaps 13, 14. The potters were paid on piecework, and a good potter could turn out between 1,200 to 1,400 pots a day. In the 30s, up to 30 potters were employed, which means that the output was about 150,000 a week, and some 7 million a year. If one considers the other local potters, i.e. E.G. Cole, that was next door to Samuel South, and Tuck, who operated from Waltham Abbey, probably we're talking about 17 million, 18 million pots per annum to the nursery industry. There were 5 kilns at South. Each kiln had a diameter of some 20 feet and could hold 40,000 pots. Samuel South flourished during the 20s and 30s, which I think was in tandem with the progress of the nursery industry. In fact, at a stock taking in 1939, 8 million pots were counted in the yard.
Another supporting industry to the nursery business was the steam sterilisation of soil. This was usually done by contractors who specialised in this branch of the business. The local firm was Maxon's of Waltham Abbey. This was necessary because obviously the soil in the greenhouses became infested with various bugs, bacteria, spores. Maxon's would arrive at the nursery with a huge steam boiler on wheels towed behind a lorry. The end of each of these branches was a metal grid with 18-inch long spikes which were driven into the ground so that the steam passed from the boiler down the main into the branches, which were controlled by valves, little taps, through the hollow spikes and out of a hole at the end, and then gradually come up through the soil, which had to reach a temperature of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The grids remained in position for about 20 minutes. The foreman would be standing by with a thermometer, which he would insert into the ground to make sure that the temperature reached the right level. Well, while this 20 minutes baking was going on, another set of grids would be moved into position so that after the 20 minutes the steam could be switched from one set of grids to the other. This, of course, was quite a lengthy process, but it was a necessary thing, and then after the whole process was finished, the soil would be sprinkled with finely chopped straw, and then a small gang of men would come in and dig the soil over, digging in the straw. The greenhouse would be ready for small tomato plants to be planted out for the next season's crop. Also supporting the industry was the experimental and research station in Turner's Hill, Cheshunt. This was set up in 1915 to investigate plant diseases and pests and the sterilisation and manuring of soils and the breeding of new varieties of plants. For many years the director was Dr. Bewley, who was a pioneer in the growing of plants without soil. In his time, the station developed a new variety of lettuce called Cheshunt Early Giant. The outbreak of war in 1939 halted the growth of the industry. The government quickly introduced regulations as to what crops could be grown, and all luxury items and non-essential foods were banned. This meant, for example, that Rochfords had to dig up their grapevines and Stevens got rid of their rose bushes. Tomatoes were the order of the day and were grown exclusively throughout the war. Nursery owners had labour problems. Workers were called up to the forces or went to work in industry for better pay. The nurseries came to rely more and more on the services of land girls and Italian and German prisoners of war. Bomb damage, of course, was another hazard, or even the fallout of shrapnel from anti-aircraft gunfire caused widespread damage to many nurseries. Because of their fragile nature, greenhouses could be severely damaged by freak weather conditions. A heavy hailstorm left a nursery looking as though it had been bombed, or a whirlwind could wreck a timber greenhouse very quickly. Thomas Rochford, the grandson of the founder of the firm, returned from the war and began a program of reconstruction and modernisation of the nursery, and began to experiment with houseplants. They developed their own marketing organisation and supplied florists and supermarkets nationwide with their houseplants.
Modern home design and decor have revived interest in indoor foliage plants, and nowhere else in Great Britain will you see them grown on a scale to compare with this.
So today we thought we'd have a look at the source of these plants, and we've come here to a nursery in Broxbourne in Hertfordshire to have a look round and also to meet some of the people who work here. Michael Nelson reports.
In the propagation house, where the life of the house plant begins, I talked to Mrs. Ellis.
Mrs. Ellis, how do you set about growing house plants?
Well, there are actually three ways of growing house plants. Firstly, of course, from seed. Secondly, by wood. And this way we use for all peperomias. We take a top cutting, so, and leaf cuttings. These are placed into beds, and after about a month to 6 weeks, they're rooted enough to come out of the bed and be potted. Now, leaf cuttings, we have here Begonia rex. This is quite a different matter. We take this stalk from to the base of the leaf. We cut all the thin edges off. The Begonia rex will not grow without a shoot, without a vein. We just cut the veins like that into the size of postage stamps. They are then laid onto a tray like this, and this is the result.
Fine. Now, what about this wood cutting?
Well, if you'd like to come along to the bed along the end of the house, I will show you what I mean. Well, this is the wood. Firstly, it has to be imported from an island off of Cuba called Puerto Rico. When it arrives, it's cut into pieces of this length and has two eyes. This is a different Bacchia wood, which is totally different to what's in the bed. That is Dracaena. This is then placed into a bed or onto a peat bed, lightly covered. After a period of time, you see the wood roots and the eye grows. And at the end of, I should say 6 to 8 months, we get a full-grown cutting, which is cut from the wood, potted into a pot. The pot is then put into a pit, which helps it to grow.
Mrs. Ellis, about yourself, you work on your own here. Don't you get
Yes.
rather bored?
No, I don't, because I'm interested in what I'm doing, and I'm always terribly busy.
Those were some of the more exotic of the 500 houseplants grown here. The managing director is Mr. Thomas Rochford.
Yes, these are finger plant.
Mr. Rochford, how would you describe a houseplant?
I think a houseplant's described, it's chosen for its decorative and attractive foliage. And also, it's got to live a reasonably long life in the home. I mean, it really has got to go, say, 3 or 4 months, up to 10 months. Then I think the other thing is it should retain its leaves.
How do you find new houseplants? I mean, do you go all over the world yourself looking for them?
Well, we get new plants from all over the world. We have contacts in America, across to Australia and the European continent, and they all know that we are interested in anything new, and they're always letting us know. I did travel 20,000 miles hunting for them around America, not in the jungle, you know, running around, but to organized nurseries where they have plants, and we found great success going to the smaller nurseries where they went in for individual plants. We also had great luck in the Caribbean.
What did you find in the Caribbean?
Well, we found some very interesting dracaenas and some very interesting new Diefenbachs.
Can you translate those into layman's language?
Well, the dracaena is known as the dragon tree. I don't know if I can help you any more than that. That's a common name for it. But they have nice spiky leaves of pretty good color.
It's hot and humid in here. How do these plants stand up to being transferred to a normal room temperature?
Well, the sun's been coming in and out a lot today, and of course it makes the temperature go up and down and creates this humidity. But there are ways of overcoming this, and that is if you can get an open bowl and fill it with peat, moist peat, and plunge your pot into that, then that moisture will go through the pot, or if it's a plastic pot, up through the hole that's designed at the bottom, and you will create humidity which go around that plant.
How did you get on last winter in that appalling cold spell?
Well, I'd rather not talk about it. It was pretty ghastly, but we're getting out of the wood now. We lost quite a lot of plants.
How do you deal with the problem of heating?
Heating, we are over to the oil heating now and central boiler house, and by the time we're finished, we shall probably consume about 1 million gallons of oil. So everything will be done on 1 million gallons of oil.
Does that mean that there's no individual stoking to be done at the greenhouse itself?
No, it will be all automatic and all in one place, central boiler house.
Do you have any rare and expensive plants here?
Well, remember, we are commercial, and therefore rare plants are a hobby, one of my hobbies. But I have been looking for a plant for 15 years, and it has just come to light. A very kind friend found it in America for me. It's called Maranta roseus pictus. So there's no price on that because we're not selling it.
But is it, in point of fact, I mean, is it valuable?
It's valuable to me, but not to the world, but it is rare.
Do you exhibit your plants at all?
We lay a great store on exhibiting. We like to put all these new plants and different plants in front of the public. And of course, the highlights are Chelsea and Southport, where they can come and they see these plants, which is so much easier than reading about them, I think.
Mr. Rochford, thank you.
Working on the nursery is Diane Coulter, a student.
What are these plants you're packing?
St. Paulias, commonly known as African violets.
Why did you decide to take up horticulture?
Well, it's always been at the back of my mind. I wanted to do agriculture first of all, and I decided that was too heavy, then forestry, so I mixed the two.
What sort of future is there when you pass out of your college?
Well, for a girl, for horticulture, there's quite a few. You can do private gardening for profit, some people do, or at one of the public parks or the royal parks, and many other jobs.
Good, well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
In the dispatch department, I spoke to the supervisor, Pat Coventry.
Miss Coventry, could you tell me what goes on here in the dispatch department?
Well, the plants are brought into here from lorries from the greenhouses. They're stacked on these benches all around here. And then the ladies come along with their trolleys and their orders, and they select the plants from the benches according to their orders, and then they wheel it back into the plant hall again.
What happens in the plant hall there?
Well, they're put onto roller conveyors, all the boxes of plants, and then the pots are all scrubbed, the leaves are all washed, and then the plants are individually labelled, and then they go down the roller conveyors and packed, ready to go away.
To see these plants in their final setting, I visited the home of the managing director, where I spoke to his wife. Mrs. Rochford, have you any tips to give about the arrangement of house plants in the home?
I think they look very much nicer when they're grouped rather than a lot of single plants. If you can get them into a trough or any sort of container, they look better.
So in this trough behind us here, how many plants approximately have you got there?
I think there are 5 or 6 there, different ones. If you can get them varied in the size of their leaves or their colouring, they look better still.
And should you have houseplants only in the living room or the drawing room?
Oh, no, anywhere. They're lovely in the kitchen.
Why in the kitchen in particular?
I think you see them more there, and also I think they like the steam and the damp that you get in there.
They feel more at home,
They feel
tropical
more at home.
atmosphere.
They probably get more care, too. You are there to watch them.
What other plants have you got here in your drawing room? The one, for instance, behind me under the picture.
That is a begonia Messoniana, commonly called the iron cross begonia because of the dark marking on the leaf, which is rather like the iron, you know, the German decoration of the iron.
Opposite you, the rather larger plant.
That is a monstra, the Mexican breadfruit plant.
Does it in point of fact have any kind of a fruit?
It has a fruit which is like a breadfruit, yes. A sort of hard thing.
And behind you, in that kind of decoration you rather favour in front of the fire?
There's a spathiphyllum, the tall white plant, and there's a Dieffenbachia exotica at this end.
Where does that come from?
It comes from the Caribbean.
What about shape in arrangement? Is that important?
I think it's terribly important in a trough. I think you've got to get the difference between the very big leaves and the rather more delicately shaped leaf. It makes a contrast.
Mrs. Rochford, thank you.
By the 1950s, Rochfords had become the world leaders in houseplants. Much of their success was due to Thomas Rochford's wife, Betty. Her flower arrangements at the big national and international flower shows, like Chelsea and the Floralie in Paris, really put the firm on the map. One year at Chelsea, the Queen Mother said to Thomas Rochford, "I really must come down to the Lea Valley sometime and see how these wonderful plants are grown." The Lea Valley Growers Association took her up on this. And the Queen Mother visited Pollard's in Longfield Lane to see tomatoes and carnations. Ernest Stevens in Andrews Lane to see roses. And then to Thomas Rochford's at Turnford to see the houseplants.
And since that time, of course, we've seen all kinds of influences that have changed the Lea Valley. The most significant aspect, of course, has been the development of London and of the towns here in West Essex and East Hertfordshire. That Cheshunt, for example, has expanded in both directions, and Hoddesdon expanded, Harlow has expanded, and London, of course, has spread northwards. The Greater London Council bought up a lot of land north of Enfield. And so one found that the great acreage was gradually being nibbled away for development of one sort or another. Then there was the Lea Valley Regional Park, which was set up, I suppose, about 30 years ago in order to create recreational space in the Lea Valley. And that also had an effect of swallowing up acreages of glass at that time, and still does today. So I think that now that we're approaching the millennium, we probably have somewhere in the region of 300 acres of glass houses in mainstream glasshouse horticulture. But that 300 acres produces more than the 1,400 acres did in the 1950s.
This is Mr. Dingerman's nursery in Darnacle Hill. For the last 20 years, this has been producing 5 million lettuces a year from 7 acres of glass. Everything is computerized and scientifically controlled. The environmental conditions are monitored, the ventilation is automatic, the temperature control is automatic, and the planting and the harvesting of the plants are all done by machine. The ground is completely covered by concrete channels through which flows a solution containing all the nutriments required for the lettuces. The channels are covered with sheets of white plastic in which there are carefully spaced holes, and through these holes the lettuces are planted by the automatic machine. The machine is unique in the world. It was designed and developed by Mr. Dingermans himself. One man is required to keep it supplied with trays of small plants in their plugs of peat. 2 trays side by side present 14 small plants to the grabs, which pick them up, space them out and plant them through the holes in the white plastic. It takes approximately 1 hour for this machine to work its way down the length of the bed and plant 3,780 lettuces. Another very modern nursery is this one in Paynes Lane, Nasing, which grows peppers. These are a comparatively new crop, and they are now becoming very popular with shoppers. The plants are grown in bags. They reach a height eventually of about 4 meters and are supported by strings. This nursery contains 37,000 plants, each of which will produce 50 or 60 peppers a year. This means that the nursery produces, at best, something over 2 million peppers. The most popular ones are the green ones and the red, but they do also grow a few yellow and orange peppers. Another interesting aspect is the use of biological controls which keep down the harmful flies and bugs on the plants. The plants are pollinated by the introduction of small boxes of bees into the greenhouses between the months of February and August. Pollination by a bee results in a perfectly formed pepper. This nursery also is completely controlled by computer as far as the atmospheric condition is concerned, temperature, humidity and so on. Feeding of the pepper plants is by a constant drip system, which contains, of course, the necessary feed required, and temperature is controlled to about 22 degrees Celsius in daytime and 19 degrees at the night time. The cropping of the peppers requires a man to sit or stand on a machine which moves slowly along the water pipes. This same nursery also produces a much more traditional Lea Valley crop, the cucumber, and has been doing so on this site for the past 18 years. These are classic examples of the success of nurserymen who have access to capital for investment in plant, who employ the most up-to-date growing techniques, and who have a market for their produce. It seems as though the future of the nursery industry lies in the hands of such people, more often than not of Italian or Dutch origin, and whose nurseries are unlikely to receive planning permission for housing or any other kind of development, at least for the next decade or two.